We'll wait 1 second for that confirmation, and there we go. All right, fantastic. Background noise here on the line as we're going through this session. This is the Azure Intelligent Edge Brief. The brief implies that these are short sessions. We've got 30 minutes for you today of some great content. I have to thank my guest speaker, Cosmos Darwin from our Azure Stack HCI PM team. I'm going to do a brief intro here to the series and then turn things over to Cosmos for the content that you're all here to hear, and I think you'll find really exciting. That's my information there. My name is Carl Rautenstrauch. I'm an intelligent edge specialist here with Microsoft. My Twitter handle is at CloudCarl. If you want to follow me and see me talk about Microsoft and microbrews, that's typically the two content pieces that I tweet about most. Few quick notes about this series itself. These are brief, as I just mentioned. We try to keep these to around 30 minutes. We do not share NDA information on these calls. We have a variety of folks on the call who may or may not have an NDA with us. So if you are interested in NDA information, please reach out to your Microsoft account team, your partner management team, or reach out to the PM team here if you're an internal. We are using Teams for these calls. It gives us an opportunity to make it easier to collaborate, for you to pop questions into the chat window and for our experts here on the call to respond. And we do, as you see up at the top of your window, record these calls and we post them so you can review them after the fact along with the presentation. So there's the short URL, aka AIEB-channel. To see the recording of this session and prior sessions and future sessions that we'll be introducing. And the last piece from me is for those who are on the line who are Azure Stack customers, just a quick note there that we did just release a new update for Azure Stack. You can find the release notes there at that shortened URL. This week here at Microsoft, we had our Inspire and Ready events for our partners and our internal employees. And if you click that link, once you get access to the presentation, you can go to the specific section where Satya talks about the importance of our intelligent edge strategy and share some really, really cool information with you. And we also released an awesome DataBox Edge customer story. That YouTube video will let you hear directly from them about how impactful that solution is and shows a really practical implication of machine learning at the edge. And we will have our DataBox Edge team on the next call so you can learn more about that solution and what it can do for you and for your customers. And then finally, Gartner released their 2019 Magic Quadrant for IaaS this week and highlighted our intelligent edge strategy as something that separates us from the pack and really has made us a leader in the IaaS quadrant. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Cosmos and have him guide us through the rest of the session and teach us a little bit here about Azure Stack HCI. Cosmos, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Carl. Just to confirm, can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great, and we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you, everybody who has tuned in this morning. My name is Cosmos Darwin. I'm a senior program manager on the Core OS engineering team at Microsoft. And for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try to give you just a flavor for what Microsoft Azure Stack HCI is and what it's for. Now, these conversations obviously have to start with Azure, right? And as I'm sure you talk about every week on this call, an important pillar of differentiation for Microsoft Azure is its hybrid capabilities. When we talk with customers, this is something that comes up over and over. In fact, the most recent survey we did showed that 87% of organizations expected that not just now, not just next year, but for the foreseeable future, they would have assets both in a public cloud and operating outside of the cloud at the edge. And being able to operate that hybrid environment and really bridge the two is both super important and it's also pretty hard. And that's where the hybrid solutions from Microsoft Azure come in. Now, Microsoft Azure is a platform that meets customers where they are. It meets your workloads where they are. And so I want to sort of position how you should think about Microsoft Azure Stack HCI in the context of a few other things that you may already know. In this diagram, we have three offers, three different ways that you can sort of take advantage of Azure. The first, of course, is simply to use public cloud services through Azure, right? So on the very far left-hand side of this image, you can consume public cloud services. And what's going on there from an infrastructure perspective is there's Azure hardware running hyperscale compute, storage, and networking, on top of which you, as a customer, use the Azure portal or the Azure APIs to access IaaS and PaaS services on top of that cloud scale compute, storage, and networking running on Azure hardware, right? So that's Microsoft Azure on the far left side of this image. In the middle of this image is Microsoft Azure Stack, and that's something that I have to imagine you've probably heard of before. Azure Stack, instead of using Azure hardware, uses industry standard hardware from the vendors that you know and probably already have a working relationship with, the likes of Dell and HPE and Lenovo and others. And running on that industry standard hardware in your data center, Azure Stack runs hyper-converged compute, storage, and networking in order to deliver the same Azure portal and the same Azure consistent APIs for IaaS and PaaS services, but running in your data center. Effectively, it allows you to operate cloud services on your premises, kind of like running your own little Azure region, right? That's Microsoft Azure Stack. So with that context, what is Microsoft Azure Stack HCI? What's the third thing on the far right of this image? Azure Stack HCI is actually geared at a slightly different set of use cases. It's for customers who want to run virtualized applications on-prem in a familiar way, but taking advantage of all the efficiency of that hyper-converged infrastructure that's been powering Azure Stack since the beginning. So it's running on that same industry standard hardware with the same hyper-converged compute, storage, and networking. But instead of presenting you with the Azure portal and Azure consistent APIs and concepts for IaaS and PaaS, it's a more familiar way to run essentially virtual machines on your premises. The reason that Azure Stack HCI exists is when we talk with customers, we really see two distinct patterns for what hybrid means to different organizations and different dev teams. There's really two approaches. The first approach is the one that we've been thinking about for a long time, which is to start in the public cloud and then deliver those cloud services in a consistent way on premises, right? And that's what Azure Stack does. That's what Azure Stack has always done. It was the first product in the market to do that, and it remains the only product in the market that can do that. That's pretty cool. But there's also another type of hybrid, and that's to start from on-prem, start from things like the servers that you may already have, and connect those up to Azure to take advantage of things like management services that are available in Azure that you can actually leverage to make your on-premises environment better. That's where Microsoft Azure Stack HCI comes in, which is the sort of new member of the family. We only just launched it a few months ago. Let me give you a few concrete examples of how you can take advantage of Azure with Azure Stack HCI. Here are 6 different Azure services. Some of these are intended to run in an inherently hybrid kind of mode. So something like Azure Site Recovery is an inherently hybrid service, right? It's about taking virtual machines or servers that are running on-prem and protecting them using the Azure cloud, right? And so you can, for example, replicate your VHD file for your Hyper-V virtual machine into Azure, and then if something terrible should happen to your site, you can boot that VM in Azure and keep running it. So that's an example of an inherently hybrid service, but there are others on this slide which didn't used to be hybrid services. Something like Azure Update Management or Azure Monitor or Azure Security Center. Originally, those were services that existed for the sake of making it easier to manage VMs in Azure, right? So you would go to the Azure portal, you deploy VMs in Azure, and then if you wanted to manage updates at scale or if you wanted to monitor them across a large fleet of virtual machines, you could use these services in Azure. What Azure Stack HCI makes possible is for you to take advantage of these services. They're still running in Azure, but they are managing assets on-prem. And so you can use Update Management or Azure Monitor to control updates or look for any kind of strange behavior for virtual machines that are actually running on your premises using these new cloud services. And it's really seamlessly integrated. So if you take, for example, Azure Site Recovery, you can discover any one of these services directly from the user interface of Azure Stack HCI. And in many cases, it's really, really seamlessly embedded into the experience. So here's, for example, the list of virtual machines that you would see if you were looking at an Azure Stack HCI cluster. And you can see there's a bunch of actions, right? So across the top, you can create a new virtual machine. You can start or turn off a virtual machine. And we've got this button that's kind of highlighted in this image, which says protect virtual machine. It doesn't say big, scary, click here to begin some kind of gnarly setup. It's not. No, it's very friendly, right? You just click the protect button. But what's actually happening behind the scenes when you do that is it is using Azure Site Recovery. You don't really have to configure all that much. It's really quite straightforward, but it's using Azure Site Recovery to protect the virtual machine you chose up into the Azure cloud. And so you get a familiar virtualization experience on-prem with the ability to leverage these Azure services and connect to Azure to make on-prem better. So what is Microsoft Azure Stack HCI? And then as a follow-up question, what is it for, right? Azure Stack HCI is hyper-converged infrastructure. Let's start there. That's what the HCI stands for. And hyper-converged infrastructure, if you haven't heard of it, is really sort of having its moment. When we talk with customers, in fact, here's a data point from the Enterprise Strategy Group. 54% of organizations with a mature data center modernization strategy expect that deploying converged or hyper-converged infrastructure is going to be among their most significant modernization investments in the next 12 to 18 months. That's a significant intention to adopt, and it's not just aspirations. In fact, the data shows it's already happening. The latest numbers from the IDC analyst firm show that investment in hyper-converged infrastructure increased 57% year over year. It's now nearly $2 billion per quarter that organizations all around the world are putting into deploying hyper-converged infrastructure. So how do you actually, what goes into an Azure Stack HCI? What's it made of inside, right? There are three essential technologies. Hyper-V, Microsoft's hypervisor, right? It's the hypervisor that we use to run Azure. Software-defined storage, specifically a set of capabilities you may have heard of called Storage Spaces Direct. And finally, software-defined networking. These are sort of the three things that you need to build a hyper-converged infrastructure. Now, I said a little bit earlier that Azure Stack HCI is supposed to be familiar, right? It's designed to be the easy on-ramp for folks who want to run virtualized applications. And so to deliver these technologies in the most familiar and easy way possible to those customers, we've actually packaged all of them up inside of Windows Server 2019. So as a customer, you need Windows Server 2019, the user interface that I showed a moment ago, Windows Admin Center. And then we've been working with our ecosystem to build validated solutions. There are, in fact, over 100 already available, where the hardware has been exhaustively stress tested in combination with this software stack. And when you take these things together, Windows Server 2019 with Windows Admin Center on partner validated hardware, you have an Azure Stack HCI solution. Okay, so that's all well and good. I've got an HCI solution. How do I manage it? The answer there, as I mentioned, is Windows Admin Center. If you haven't heard of Windows Admin Center, let me give you just a flavor for sort of what it is. Windows Admin Center is the future of our edge and server management, local management story. It works with a number of different versions of Windows Server already, and we're continually increasing that matrix. And it's a local, completely works disconnected HTML5 web-based management experience that, as you can see, is significantly cleaner and nicer and just better organized than really anything we've had for this kind of thing before. It's no additional cost. So as soon as you have any kind of, like in this case, for example, Windows Server, you can use Windows Admin Center to manage it. There's no upsell. It's not sold separately. And it's very easy to deploy. You can download it and get it set up in about 5 minutes. And you can use it for all kinds of stuff. In fact, there's a whole set of dedicated screens that are especially for hyper-converged infrastructure in Windows Admin Center. So, for example, you can provision your storage, which is the screen we're looking at here. And you can do things like monitor its performance. How many IOPS is it doing? What's the latency look like? All of that information in this beautiful browser-based experience. You can, of course, opt into features like deduplication and compression, or expand your storage if you're running out of capacity. You can manage all the virtual machines across your cluster in a single list with a nice combination of different properties and status and resource information, as well as, of course, those integrations that I mentioned with the Azure cloud for things like Azure Site Recovery. And you can dig all the way down into deep hardware troubleshooting if that's what you need to do or that's what you want to do. So in this case, we're looking at a set of fairly advanced latency statistics for actual individual SSDs in this environment. So that's the management pane for Azure Stack HCI, which is delivered through Windows Admin Center to complement how the core technologies are actually delivered through Windows Server. Both of these things make it very, very easy for a customer to adopt Azure Stack HCI. So what is it actually for? We understand how you can take advantage of Azure and sort of what is involved in Azure Stack HCI, but what's it for? And there are really two scenarios that I think are worth emphasizing. The first one is data center modernization. So what do I mean by that? Here is sort of what you would expect if you walked through a typical customer data center or even just an old Microsoft data center, right? You would expect this 3-tier infrastructure architecture. Starting from the bottom, you have a SAN, a storage area network. To connect your hypervisors to that SAN, you have a storage fabric. Then, of course, you have your hypervisors, your compute servers. This is where most of your applications are running. You might have some appliances for things like network load balancing or firewall or something. And then connecting those appliances to the hypervisors and everything to the outside world, you have your Ethernet switches. Right? This is a 3-tier infrastructure architecture. With hyperconverged infrastructure, you can modernize and you can consolidate that down into a much smaller footprint. This is something we see all the time when we talk with our customers. You can get rid of the SAN, the storage area network. You don't need a storage fabric anymore once you don't have a SAN. And what you're doing instead is you're really adding drives into the hypervisors and then providing software-defined compute, storage, and networking directly from the hypervisor. In a sense, these Hyper-V hypervisors are now bringing their own software-defined infrastructure, their own software-defined storage and software-defined networking. Just as you can get rid of the SAN by moving the drives up into the hypervisor hosts, you can actually, in many cases, do away with the need for a hardware appliance because there's a software load balancer, a software gateway, and a bunch of other important software-defined networking capabilities just included as part of the hyperconverged infrastructure stack. Now, an important characteristic for customers is when doing this, obviously, you need to retain all of the enterprise-grade features that you expect across things like encryption for data in transit and at rest, the ability to provide, robust fault tolerance with 2-way and 3-way mirroring and erasure coding, and a range of other technologies. And Azure Stack HCI delivers on all of these, providing a true enterprise-grade replacement for a SAN or for a network appliance. And even though all of this has been consolidated into the hypervisor, it's all running on the same set of servers, it delivers unbeatable performance. Azure Stack HCI is on the leading edge of x86 hardware innovation. Whether we're talking about NVMe SSDs or the latest Gen 2 Intel Scalable processors, or remote direct memory access, RDMA for networking, or persistent memory and Intel Optane, all of these are technologies which are supported from the day they launched on Microsoft Azure Stack HCI. And just to give you a sense for what's possible with all of this innovation, at Microsoft Ignite last fall, we teamed up with our friends at Intel, and we wanted to see if we could set a hyper-converged infrastructure industry record for performance. So we used 12 servers from Intel. They were a reference design that we collaborated with them on. And we installed an early, slightly preview build of what would become Azure Stack HCI. And we used that to deliver over 13 million IOPS, random I/O operations per second, from a single cluster. This is over 1 million per node because it's a 12-node system. We have yet to see any other major hyper-converged infrastructure vendor come anywhere even close to this. And so that's an example of how Azure Stack HCI is not only able to sort of enable you to consolidate your data center and still deliver all the enterprise-grade features, but more importantly, still deliver performance and, in fact, deliver performance above and beyond what you've ever seen before from infrastructure. So that's data center modernization. That's the first thing that Azure Stack HCI is really good for. There is a second thing, though, and that's remote office and branch office modernization. So that sounds pretty different from, big data center modernization with millions of IOPS. So what's this about? Well, we often do fixate on these kinds of 4, 8, 12, 16 node deployments that are aimed at a core data center where we can talk about running hundreds or thousands of virtual machines. But with Azure Stack HCI, you can actually scale all the way down to a very small remote office or branch office deployment for use at the edge, right? You can go into box stores and retail stores or field sites and installations where you're just deploying maybe a very small number, like 2 or 3 nodes, with a small number of virtual machines. In fact, the minimum footprint for Azure Stack HCI is very small. You can start with just 2 nodes. There's no minimum processor or memory requirement. You can start with just 4 SSDs, or if you want to do a hybrid configuration, 2 SSDs and 4 HDDs in each of the servers. So 2 servers with a couple of drives each. They do not need to be SAS drives. You don't need NVMe. We absolutely support just direct attached SATA. That's certainly going to be the cheapest and easiest way to get started. You can take those 2 nodes and network them back to back using a crossover cable. You just need a single 10 gigabit link. That's all we require. You don't need RDMA necessarily. That allows you to go switchless, which is really important if you're doing like hundreds or thousands of deployments into every branch of a business or every retail store where you're very cost sensitive to the per unit price of each location. Being able to do this with no switch, where you just network the 2 servers back to each other, is a huge benefit. And if you want to take advantage of every drive slot you have to actually get usable capacity, you can absolutely boot one of these things from an M.2 NVMe SSD or from a SATA DOM. Those are both allowed. So it's a very, very small minimum footprint. And in fact, if you look in our hardware catalog, there are a lot of really interesting systems at that very, very small scale. Some of them are rack mount. So you see here, for example, the PowerEdge R440 from Dell EMC, or the ThinkSystem SR630 from Lenovo. Those are both 1U rack mount systems. But there are also some tower form factors, right? I'll talk about like the ProLiant ML350 Gen 10 from HPE. Potentially in a branch office or a retail store, you don't have a rack or you don't have a half rack, and that's okay. You can absolutely deploy Azure Stack HCI using towers like you see on this slide. Now, what's cool is it's not just support for small hardware. Azure Stack HCI can actually do some pretty interesting stuff on top of this very small hardware. There's one feature that I think is really cool, so I figured I would talk about it, which is called nested resiliency. This is one of the reasons that we believe Azure Stack HCI is really differentiated from any other hyper-converged offering down at the sort of 2-node scale. Historically, the way that hyper-converged infrastructure has worked with 2 nodes relies on a technology called two-way mirroring. People have different names for it, but the general idea is you have 2 servers, you have some drives in each server, and you're going to take all the data on one server and copy all of it over to the other server. And then you have a replica, and then if you have a drive failure, that's totally fine, right? All of your data is safe because you had another copy. In fact, even if you have a whole server go down, for example, if you're applying updates or if you blow a power supply or something, that's also totally fine because you have, again, a replica. But heaven forbid you should lose a drive and a server or a drive on each server at the same time, then two-way mirroring is not actually sufficient to protect your data. And this was a real limitation for a long time with 2-node hyper-converged infrastructure. And it still is, by the way, with every option except Azure Stack HCI. With Azure Stack HCI, we decided we could do better than this, specifically for that kind of branch office customer. We took inspiration from actually a kind of old technology called nested RAID, specifically RAID 5+1. Now, obviously, we're not doing RAID here. We're not using a hardware RAID card, none of that. But we took inspiration from it for our software. The idea here is to do a parity encoding, like what you might think of as RAID 5 if you're familiar with RAID, within the first server, and then replicate that over onto the second server using a full mirror. And then what you get is essentially RAID 5 or a single parity stripe again in the other server. Now, this uses the same technology that Azure Stack HCI relies on at very large scale to do erasure coding. It's technology that was pioneered with by the folks over in Microsoft Research. But taking that same technology, scaling it down, we can deliver this kind of nested resiliency in Azure Stack HCI, which means that with just a 2-node cluster, that tiny hardware I was showing you just a second ago, you can not only tolerate a drive failure in both nodes at the same time, and it's fine, all your virtual machines keep running, but even better, you can actually tolerate a drive failure and a whole server going down at once. And again, it's no problem. All the virtualized applications that you're running on Azure Stack HCI will continue to run. They won't even notice that this has occurred because they will still have full access to all of their storage through the magic of this nested resiliency in software. And again, there's no special hardware you need. We're not talking about hardware RAID with a RAID card. It's completely in software. So that's Azure Stack HCI for Branch Office. So how do you get started, right? If this is interesting, if you have a customer or if you are a customer who has a data center that needs modernizing, your hardware is due for a refresh, or you have a branch office or a set of retail stores or something like that where you need to deploy resilient infrastructure with a small minimum footprint, how do you get started? Well, the good news is there are more than 100 solutions available today ready to transact, almost all of them available globally from over 15 partners. The partners whose logos you see on this slide represent more than 90% of the server market. It is very likely that whoever your preferred hardware vendor is, they are on this slide, whether that's Lenovo or Dell EMC or HPE or Cisco, Fujitsu, and a number of other players who are really important regionally, like Hitachi in Japan, or Thomas Kren and PrimeLine in Germany. So these partners, we've been working very closely with them for a number of years now, honestly. We've been co-engineering with them to design systems that are especially built for Azure Stack HCI. And you can find all of those systems on the Azure Stack HCI catalog at microsoft.com/HCI for hyper-converged infrastructure. Now that's the first step, right, is to find solutions from your preferred hardware vendor. Once you have them, you can work with the vendor. They vary a little in how they want to do this, to install Windows Server 2019, set up Windows Admin Center, and then optionally connect to hybrid services for management. You can pick and choose as many or as few as you'd like depending on your needs. So Azure Site Recovery, Azure Monitor, whatever it is that's going to make sense for your business. So looks like we are almost at time. And with that, that's everything I wanted to share. So that hopefully is a useful overview or introduction to Microsoft Azure Stack HCI. Once again, I'm Cosmos. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to stick around and take some questions as well.
Cosmos, that was amazing on the timing. Wow, you brought it home with minutes to spare. Excellent work.
Thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah, nice job. And that was a great overview as well. I mean, boy, I think you touched all the important topics and the highlights. And folks, please don't hold back. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask. This call is for you and for your benefit. So whether they're in the chat or you are also, of course, more than welcome to unmute your microphone and ask Cosmos questions on what he just presented to us. Very, very well. I like it, Jonathan. That's my type of question. So my favorite microbrew, huh? Oh man, boy, it's hard to pick just one, isn't it? Because I'm headed to Redmond later today, I've got to get a shout out to Postdoc Brewing's Alpha Factor, one of my favorite IPAs of all time. So if anybody else is going to be in Redmond over the course of the next week, send me a DM on Twitter. I'd be happy to meet you there and share a brew. And Matt, you know the answer to that question.
By which he means, of course, it's yes.
I don't know who's sponsoring that, but McSpirit's trying to give away kit. He's looking for somebody. Always asking for the free stuff. All right. Well, looks like we've got the jokesters done with their questions. So I think we're good. Thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it. Cosmos and Dwayne, can't thank you guys anymore. Great job. Tremendous job assembling the content and and putting it together for a very, very short period of time here online with us. I'm going to stop the recording. I am traveling, so for those who are looking for the copy of that recording and the presentation, it's going to take me a little while to get to that, but I should be able to do that when I get to Redmond this evening. And thanks all very much for joining us. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, guys. Everybody take care.